You're listening to Winnipeg's Classic 107. My name is Simon Rusnak. It's the first Friday of the month, and regular listeners know what that means. Chris Hall from McNally Robinson Booksellers has joined me in studio to share his latest picks in the What to Read feature. Welcome back, Chris.
Good morning, Simon.
Chris, I have to say, I seriously considered rebranding this segment this month to What Happened to the Winnipeg Jets, as they've closed the book on such a promising season, but yes. I don't think we're going to get to that, are we?
Well, no, but I've been saying spring is officially here. Playoffs are over, so...
So why not find some new reading? Let's chat a little bit about, this diverse list as always. Where are we going to start things off this month?
We're going to start with a novel, a little bit different novel for me. It's called All Fours, and it's by Miranda July. And Miranda July, she's a writer, obviously, and she's also a filmmaker and an artist. She's known to readers for her debut novel, The First Bad Man, which sold very well, and then for her story collection, No One Belongs Here More Than You. And in this new novel, a semi-famous artist, she announces that she's going to drive cross-country from L.A. to New York. But 30 minutes after she leaves her husband and child at home, she spontaneously exits the freeway, checks into a nondescript motel, and immerses herself in an entirely different journey, I will call it. It's a novel that pushes boundaries. She's exploring sexual freedom that she's never done before. But it's no more explicit than your standard romantic comedy novel. But it is very much more real, I believe. Has that same yearning for connection, acceptance, and those sorts of emotions. But it doesn't shy away from our vulnerabilities, our imperfections, confusions, aging bodies in this case. So it's a very real version of some of what's going on in some of the fantasy romance novels that are so popular these days.
You mentioned it being real. I was reading a number of reviews. Other kind of ways it's been described, there's a sort of giddiness, a wittiness about this, but also a sexiness too. And it sounds like a real sort of mastery of form there that she's found, right?
Yeah, she finds a kind of balance, and it's funny but poignant. Described one of the books last month like that. It just captures this nice balance of life.
So the next selection comes from an author I'm somewhat embarrassed to say I haven't read, but I did see the movie based on a book. Can you tell us about this highly anticipated follow-up to Brooklyn?
Well, you are way behind because Long Island is the name of the novel, and it is by one of my favorite novelists. Do I say that too often now? But anyway, his name is Colm Tóibín. He is Irish, and I have read so many of his, and I always look forward to the next one. So yes, he wrote a book a few years ago called Brooklyn, which, as you say, got made into a movie. He's also authored many other novels as well as nonfiction, but novels like The Master, which was about Henry James, and The Magician, which was about Thomas Mann. Now, Brooklyn, the previous novel, told the story of Eilish Lacey, who she emigrated from Ireland to America. It's the 1950s. And in Long Island, subsequently, we find her married to a fellow named Tony Fiorello, and they're raising their young daughter and son. One day, a stranger shows up at the door. He's got an Irish accent, and he brings news that disrupts her life entirely. That happy, secure life is just gone. And she suddenly feels very far from home, and the revelation drives her to return to Ireland. She goes back to her mother and her brothers, finds a kind of safe space to ask questions and decide where she's going to go from here. It's a very character-driven novel. It's not a lot of plot. It's just Eilish and her emotions and her feelings and her confusions, working through all of these things. There are other characters as well that it gets into. He's just so great at that level of storytelling. Such a great writer. Can't recommend him high enough.
Okay, well, I know what I'm adding to my summer reading list here, Chris. And I mean, we're looking outside the window. It's dreary, it's cool, but I don't think it's too early to start thinking about summer reading lists.
No, I don't think it is.
Especially here in the city where we have to make the most of our summers. Speaking of the city, see what I did there?
Nicely done.
Where are we off to next?
Well, we're off to home. It's a book called Winnipeg. It is Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Center, and it is by Negon Sinclair, who's known to many of us. Very fond of Negon. He is a columnist, of course, with the Winnipeg Free Press. And this is the basis of this book are those years of columns, and that's really the foundation. And he builds an argument that Winnipeg is a place that he's calling ground zero for Canada's future. Winnipeg has the largest population of urban Indigenous people in the country, and They are forming and contributing to solutions for this country where we've forgotten principles of treaty and inclusivity. So we meet creators, leaders, everyday people. They're preserving their own heritage, but also kind of making their way into the future. Of course, he also visits the ugly side of colonialism, the Indian Act, the communities who suffer most from its atrocities. He's the receiver of emails that would make the hair on your arm stand up, I'm afraid. So it's a Winnipeg book on the one hand, but it's also a claim that there's something really interesting happening here. We have been the first province to elect an Indigenous premier, for example, and he says it's a place where, since time immemorial, land, water, people, and animals have met here, and it's a center from which a new world can be created.
Yeah, Nigan Sinclair, one of those voices that just carries such weight in
does.
what he says or what he writes, especially, and I was reading kind of the preface to this book, talking about how we're at such a crucial and fragile moment in Canada's long history with Indigenous peoples. You are going to be celebrating the launch of this book, McNally, Grant Park in the Atrium, Thursday, May 30th, 7 p.m., hosted by Sheila Rogers. Should be a very insightful evening indeed.
Yes.
As we spend more and more time online in front of screens, there's something to be said about a physical book. And you don't have any here in studio with you today, Chris, but so often you bring them. And I mean, they are such wonderful things. And this next title celebrates books and those who make them.
It does, yeah. It's a book right up my alley, of course. It's called The Bookmakers, A History of the Book in 18 Lives by a fellow named Adam Smith. This is the 500-year history of the printed book in English, but told through the people who created them. And so Smith is a professor of English literature and the history of the book, which I didn't realize there was a university spot for that. But anyway, at Oxford University. And he's also runs a small printing press himself. So he's got credentials for this book. He begins in the 15th century in London with the aptly named Wynkyn de Worde, who printed the Times bestsellers. He introduces us then to a fellow named William Wildgoose. I don't know why the names are so
names.
great.
I'm sold already on this book and these bookmakers.
William Wildgoose. He trained in Germany, and then where, of course, the printing press was invented and all the skills were being developed, and then he returned to London to ply his trade. We meet metal workers because the printing, the type punches, were so important, and they were made of metal. John Baskerville really took it to a new level, so we meet him. Yeah, and all the way through development of paper and illustration techniques right up to the present day where there continues to be printing and binding experiments being done. So we get to peer into the pages of some great old books with that wonderful marginalia of 200 years ago. Somebody scrawled their response or something, and you don't know where it comes from, but I find that fascinating. So yeah, great journey, great tour.
Yeah, a great journey, a great tour. And let me get the plug in there. If you're looking to peruse the wonderful world of books, why not head down to McNally Robinson Booksellers? Should be your go-to spot. Sort of like if you're looking to indulge in classical and jazz music, you should probably listen to Classic 107. And with that last pick, I can't help but think you're maybe playing to the audience here, Chris. What's our last selection this month?
I'm not above that. It is called The Jazzmen, and it is by Larry Tye, and this is the story of three kings of jazz: Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie. So Edward Kennedy Ellington, he was the grandson of slaves, and his adopted name, it's got as much of a story to itself as his life story itself. Louis Daniel Armstrong, he was born in a slum in New Orleans. It was so tough it was called the battlefield. And this fellow, he took his talent with a 10-cent horn, and he just took that to an international career, and we all know him. William James Basie, son of a coachman and laundress, dreamed of escape from his world, and got some help from a fellow named Fats Waller. So the book tells their story in music, of course, but also the experience of their world in their day. It was full of discrimination, obstacles put in their way. It's a miracle they became who they became. Despite that, they opened the eyes of wider population in America and beyond. And they're credited with providing the soundtrack for the civil rights movement. So they came along right along the same time. So inspiring stories in that way, but also great for music fans. You're right.
I mean, these are lauded and celebrated individuals, and there's been plenty written on Ellington and Armstrong and Basie. What do you think makes this work by Larry Tye unique?
Well, I think that there's so many different connections and combinations, and I think as the world goes on, we learn more about the world, let alone their stories. So I think we're a little bit more knowledgeable about the good and the bad of our past. So that certainly comes through in this book.
So yes, jazz fans, those curious, mark it down. Another one to add to that summer reading list, or the now list, whenever. The Jazzmen by Larry Ty. As you know, I've got you here in the studio, Chris. There's plenty going on at McNally. Book launches like that of Nigan Sinclair's that we were just chatting about earlier, plus community classroom events and so much more. We're fresh off of Independent Bookstore Day. I saw a nice little feature in the Globe and Mail. My parents clipped it out for me and handed it to you. The
Very
indie
nice.
bookstore that has it going on.
Yeah.
One other little note, I was on the website, McNallyRobinson.com, and I noticed a book tour has officially launched. Information sessions are happening. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, this is a harebrained scheme I've had for a long time that's coming to fruition, maybe. It is the idea of a traveling book club. So we are going to, the plan is to meet the last Thursday of next January, February, and March, and then almost exactly the last Thursday of April, go for a tour. And the destination is Scotland. I'm calling it the first journey of the traveling book club of McNally Robinson. So who knows where we can go from there? But I've just had this in my mind. It's a lot of parts of my world coming together.
Yeah, and I guess, just to kind of hear a little bit more about this incredible scheme you've crafted, the idea being we'll read an author and then end up where that book has been set. Is that sort of what's going on?
Yeah, more or less. Not aiming for anything too specific.
Yeah.
It's hard to put that much pressure. But yeah, share some reading. Read, not specific books, well, some specific books, but read whatever you like. And you just end up, I think, on a bus tour with a lot of other people who've read a lot of the same books and about the same places. So whether you've read Robbie Burns or not, when we end up in Robbie Burns' house, one of us will have read Robbie Burns and,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
can tell others about it. But
Such a cool idea. Hoping it gets off the ground. And again, I was looking online, and you're going to be away that sort of last Thursday of April, April 25th through May 8th. And that does encompass the first Friday, Chris. So are we
dare.
taking the show on the road,
Oh
May
my
2025? Dare to dream. Dare to dream. It should be fantastic. As always, Mother's Day is just around the corner. McNally, a great spot for that. So all the more reason to head to McNally Robinson Grant Park or the Forks or online, McNallyRobinson.com. Chris, as always, lovely to see you.
thank you, Simon.